Hey everyone, Jeremy here, as always, host of the Towards Data Science podcast. I'm also on the team over at the Sharpest Minds Data Science Mentorship Program, and today's episode, we're talking to Sanyam Bhutani, who is a return guest. We don't have that many repeat guests yet, but he's one that I really wanted to have back on the podcast to talk a little bit about this idea of networking in data science. I think this is something that's super undervalued even today, especially in some ways because of COVID, since that's moved everything online. The idea of connecting in person, if you will, or at least remotely or over video chat with people in the community, building a brand for yourself through those in-person interactions is really, really important. And I think it's something that's really undervalued. A lot of people seem to think that getting jobs in data science is a technical issue. You just have to kind of build up those technical skills, be able to perform well during those technical interviews. But really, getting your foot in the door is as much about personal brand and who you know as anything else. And so there are a whole bunch of different ways you can approach this. They differ depending on what your personality is like. So one thing I want to talk to Sanyam today about is the strategies he's found useful as an introvert. So we'll explore that. We'll talk a little bit about what networking looks like for introverts, what hacks you can use if you're a little bit more shy, and then what techniques you can use as well to leverage your extroversion if you're on the other side of that spectrum, if you're comfortable in large crowds, if you're comfortable talking to people on a regular basis, how can you leverage that as well? Whole bunch of other stuff we'll be talking about as well, so I'm really looking forward to diving into this one. Thanks so much for watching, and here we go. Hi everyone, we're here with Sanyam Bhutani, who among a great many other things, is the host of the Chai Time Data Science Show. It's a really great podcast. I've been on it. My co-founder, Ed's been on it. Almost everyone I know has been on it at this point. He's just been really good at coordinating the community and getting people together. That's one of the things we want to talk about today, is just this idea of how to essentially find your niche in the data science community, how to leverage that niche into building a brand, and how to leverage that brand into ultimately job opportunities and just opportunities to contribute in general, which I think is really important. Sanyam, you have, I think among other things, you have this role as an engineer and content creator at H2O.ai. Maybe we can start there, because it's such a kind of cool mix of these two areas that you specialize in. Do you mind explaining a little bit what that role looks like?
Sure. But before that, thanks for having me on the podcast. I think that's sort of a funny introduction, because I really enjoyed Towards Data Science podcast that you host, and I get to learn a lot, sort of get embarrassed a lot that I need to really improve my podcast. But thanks for the opportunity.
It's funny, but just before we started turning on the recording for this one, I was just like taking in all this instruction from Sanyam, all this advice about how to set up our podcast. So I really appreciate the humility, Sanyam, but I think it's safe to say you're very knowledgeable in these things. So sorry, please go ahead.
Sure. So at H2.ai, we have our goal as a company is to democratize AI. And our internal slogan, the motto that we follow is "Makers Gonna Make." And people have their own interpretation. I've been interviewing our grandmasters, trying to understand their interpretation of it. My interpretation is there's a lot of freedom to what we can do. And for example, me as a person, I get to run this podcast. I get to meet people. I really enjoy talking to Kaggler grandmasters. And we have 18 Kaggler grandmasters at H2O. So it's really easy to just ping them on Slack, have them on the podcast. Mm-hmm. Apart from that, I am mostly driven by curiosity. In my previous interview, I had told you that I sort of almost in a week or two gave up all of my Bay Area salaries to start this podcast because I wanted to. So there's a lot of freedom. For example, we're teaching a course right now, and I said, hey, I want to take up the deep learning module. And usually the questions that you would expect in the industry is, why do you want to do that? And what we get to hear at H2O is, sure, let us know how we can help. The other day, I requested if I could start a study group. Sure, let us know. That sounds interesting. Maybe we'll join a call. Maybe we'll take a meetup as well.
That's really cool. Yeah. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So my role, it's pretty much a startup. We have a startup culture. So I have a lot of independence to do the podcast, work on other content ideas. I guess we'll get into this a bit, but right now I'm sort of more focused on creating content for the community. So it's total freedom. It's a paradise for me because I get to explore all my ideas.
Yeah, and it's funny because your job title mixes that kind of engineering piece with the content piece. And I think to a lot of people, those sound like two different jobs, but nowadays, especially, you look at data science, you look at data engineering, machine learning engineering, pretty well anything, even software engineering. the idea of building a brand in this space is so critical to getting any kind of job opportunities, any kind of networking opportunities. Can you speak to some of so first off, like, how did you start content creation? What was say the easiest path in? And then what were some of the benefits as far as kind of creating networking opportunities and getting your way into working with companies and stuff like that?
Sure. It basically started as just I went on Medium, I created an account, and I wrote about the first idea that could come to my head. How did this start? I took the world's best deep learning course. I'm very biased, but it's called Fast.ai.
Yeah.
And in that course, Jeremy Howard, the creator of the course, really encourages people to write blog posts. And I guess that was really helpful to me because I was an undergrad. Not that after graduation I become a smarter person at all, but at that point I was really intimidated by reading research papers. Apparently the norm at that time was you need to be able to read research papers, contribute to GitHub. And here was this course that was teaching us just write a blog post about what you've learned literally in the last week. And then Jeremy Howard himself would show our peers, this is a really cool blog, go check it out. I can't think of a better motivator than that. And that sort of kicked things off for me.
So does that imply, and I totally agree with the blog post thing. I think that's so critical, not just because it puts your ideas out there, but it also forces you to organize your ideas. Like when you build a project, it's easy to say, okay, I've got the Jupyter notebook, I've got the plots, the EDA, and then I've got the model evaluation at the end or whatever. And then you kind of go, okay, I'm all done here. But you haven't necessarily constructed a narrative around your project. And really, when you're interviewing, when you're pitching yourself to anyone, it's the narrative that you're going to have to pitch. You're going to have to tell a story around the project. It's not going to be enough to say, oh, I've got a AUC score of 0.95 and blah, blah, blah. Like nobody really cares about that.
Yeah.
So like, was that something you noticed as well? Is that something that you found yourself? Like, how did these blog posts play into your ability to like pitch yourself within the community or to companies?
I guess one of the really neat hacks around even sharing this would be just write a blog post and then talk about it, present it. And if you're sad about people are not reading your blog post, that'll help in that way. And you'll also end up refining the blog post. People think you can't refine a blog post. Research papers get updated all the time. Go on archive, you can see different versions. You're allowed to edit the blog post. So that's how I went about it. And in terms of meeting people, I think I also think a lot about creating content that has a good lifespan. Now, not to sound too sophisticated, but if every day a new paper comes out in deep learning, you see it's pretty much on top of your Twitter feed for a day or two. Now, you could try to keep up with the hype and constantly create blog posts around them. That has their own importance. I totally respect that. Then, but there's other side of things as well, some foundational materials or interviews. So I was more inclined towards eventually creating things that would last over a period. So for example, even people that would watch my interview with you today, I'm sure they'll get a lot of insights of how can they get mentored in data science or how should they break into the field. So
Yeah.
that was my thought process.
That makes a lot of sense. I think this is one of those, like, one of the main reasons that you would blog rather than tweet about machine learning in the first place is you want to generate evergreen content. The job search can last months. So right off the bat, that's a really important reason to have content that is, constantly collecting views and it's always relevant. And then also you could always be on the job search, like, who knows, a year and a half, 2 years from now. And if you can pull back those old blog posts and use them for that as well, it's so valuable.
What was helpful at that time to me was I was in college. I wasn't legally allowed to have a job and I was bored of the lectures. So I started consultancy and I figured out a way around the tax system. You're allowed to have a tax break. So I was this kid living a tax-free life, earning money, enjoying it. And I found a way around getting better opportunities, which was find a job role or a project that you're interested in working on, create a small blog on it, and make sure I put in the story elements in there. I think I would have removed these in case so I would use a lot of PyTorch 4.4 at that time. And I've now removed the posts that are redacted. But at that time, just write a post about it and send it to the person. Hey, I worked on this project. I saw that you've created a posting on this. Can I get on a call? Can I work with you on this?
Yeah, I very strongly agree with this. I think this is one of the things, actually one of the biggest things we've seen at Sharpest Minds is like most people tend to overvalue very easy application strategies. So like it's not uncommon for me to talk to somebody who has applied to a job board. Our typical numbers are a job board application has about a 1 to 2% probability of leading to an interview.
Yeah.
And that's actually like, I mean, that's because of like the market incentives, market forces have hit this equilibrium where it's so easy to apply through a job board or through like LinkedIn Easy Apply that everybody is applying through those things and there's just a ton of noise. So your odds are really low. Whereas some of these other strategies, like the one you're mentioning right now, like where you invest an awful lot of time, what seems like an insane amount of time to write a blog post that's tailored to a specific job posting. Those are really undervalued. And that's the way that you tend to get noticed, at least from what our stats seem to say. It's interesting that you've seen that as well.
It's yeah, I think it's not just specific to the profile as well. It remains on your profile, right? People will eventually read it. Hopefully,
Yeah.
someone in the future. And if there's one posting about it, sure there have to be other as well, unless it's like
Yeah.
very out of the blue project. So it'll say that it'll help you in the long term as well.
That's true. Yeah, I guess in a way that I've started to think of job postings as almost like they're like training labels. They tell you what the ground truth is. Like this is what the market wants, and then like every time you apply to a job posting, ideally you should learn from that process, and then you should get better at the next one. And so connecting your content generation, whether that's building projects, writing blog posts, or doing podcasts, to a specific like job posting really helps you hit that ground truth. Helps you use that label.
Yeah, and early in college, in my second year, I would just apply to any job post at all, try to get an interview. And I also made it to a bunch of interviews that were for senior positions. And then later, my approach to this, and I wouldn't recommend it, I didn't mention that I was a student. And people were happy with that fact. No one asked me anything. The
Yeah,
second approach was I grew a pretty big beard. So I would appear elder
that's
than
true.
I
You
was.
shaved. Yeah.
And that would make people trust me more. So I would get into interviews and just understand what's actually happening here and how does the interviewing pipeline even look like, just
Right.
out of curiosity. And I looked at that as a free practice ground for just taking interviews.
I think that's actually like, first off, I love the boldness of that. I think it actually reflects a deep truth with the hiring market, which is that so many of these, the kinds of hoops that you're made to jump through during the application process are actually arbitrary and somewhat unserious.
Yeah.
So when people look at, a job application, they'll see like a whole bunch of requirements. And I don't think most people realize you only need to meet like 60 to 70% of the requirements to really be in a good spot for that job. Was that sort of part of what played into this, like you getting interviews for these senior roles, even though you were just a student?
I would just figure out the things that they would really want, try to understand that. Sometimes even contact the people that are working there and see if I can work on those projects and just try to build something small along those skills. And that's how it looked pretty natural to me because I was freelancing, and that's how I pitched to
Mhm.
customers slash clients, whatever you want to call them. So it was natural to me at that point. And then I would ask later on, hey, can I join an internship and join the complete role later on? I'm in my sophomore year right now, which would annoy some people.
Well, can you share an example of one of those sort of customizations or customized projects that you did that was focused on a particular job opportunity?
Sure. One that comes to my mind, and this was also a project that I had worked on, so that was pretty convenient. It was building something along the lines of an OCR receipt reader role. And I had built an MVP of sorts in a freelance project. So I just moved that to the top of my resume, moved that to the top of my GitHub while applying. And that sort of got me into the role, and moved that also on to the top of, we're supposed to write a letter or something. I think it's statement of purpose. So just highlighted that, and that was pretty helpful.
How much of an impact do you think moving things around on your resume, rearranging your GitHub has? I'm just curious about what your experience has been on that.
Uh, I, I never did an A/B test. To me, that was natural that every company has their own interest, and you would want your interest to align with them, and their interest to align with yours as well. And this is true to working with freelance clients as well, because you talking just with one person, I wouldn't want to annoy them, and you'd want to agree with them. So to me, that was sort of a natural process of just selling myself, if I may, because that's how I started in freelance, which was just convincing the person that, hey, I will be able to do this job that you've posted.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting because it's again like this theme of very customized applications where you're investing a lot of time and attention to each company to make them feel like you're, like the perfect fit for them, rather than doing a spray and pray where you're just like, sending out 100 applications or whatever. It's really interesting. Yeah.
One of the interesting things to me was I did a lot of repeat internships, and that's sort of also easy and interesting in one way. And the other way around that is when I would show up at my internship and I would be spending my lunch break, I'd just walk up to different people. And one thing I realized that senior people really love sharing the knowledge. So I would just reach out to them. Hey, I'm working as an intern on this project. I'm just curious about what tasks are you working on. Uh, they tell me a few days later, I'll just look around, Google up, create some basic script that would sort of put that together, show it to them. And that would later lead into a return internship at the same company as well.
Right. Yeah. I love that customization. It's all about making people feel special too, right? Because like, I don't know, I think it's so easy for a job applicant to like abstract away all the personality traits of the people who are reviewing your resume or the people doing the interview, and think of them as like these robots who don't have emotions, who don't have like attention spans. And when you do that, you miss out on all these really important strategies.
It's fun. So in hindsight, I wasn't just doing this. I was just exploring and actually checking if I'm even capable of getting a job or if I'm even capable of making money while being in college. So I was just trying to pattern match my way into it, or sort of use rewards as an approach to orienting myself sort of in a reinforced learning fashion.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so one thing I want to talk to you about absolutely is sort of the background behind you, almost literally, which is the Chai Time Data Science podcast. So you decided to jump into this. I think were you doing podcasts before H2O?
Yes, I had started Chai Time Data Science, the podcast that I host, and it's kind of funny. Usually, behind me, I open the guest profile. Today, I was even sort of reluctant if I should even leave the podcast open. I guess I still left it.
No, it's great. I think it's a great idea to the importance of personal brand, right?
Yeah. So I started this. It's around October last year, a few months before that, I guess. It was just on the spot decision. I had been interviewing people in a blog post format. Because so I think there are two kind of introverts in computer science, right? One that look at their own shoes while they're talking to you, and the other that look at your shoes while they're talking to you. I was sort of the first one. I was really shy as a person. So I started with blog interviews, reaching out to people, interviewing them in a blog format. That later felt like I was asking a person that I really respected to write a blog post for me. So I put that on a stop. Then after I graduated, I thought, hey, now I have time. I could just start a podcast, and that's pretty much overnight. That's how I decided to start the podcast.
And so why a podcast? Like, because the reason I ask is, I think a lot of people think that the podcast market is saturated. I don't think that's the case. I think there's specific reasons why it can really, really make sense to start a podcast, especially in data science or machine learning. But do you have any thoughts about that? Like, what are the key motivators that you would see as like that's a really good reason to start a podcast?
So this would sound smart because I'm sort of reflecting, but to me, everything is sort of driven by interest. So if I find something really exciting, I would just jump on it, just apply to a position. That's how I've been going around. That's how I started the Fast AI course or even freelancing, because I thought this is interesting. Let me try that. In hindsight, and to people who feel discouraged about about podcasting, let's take towards data science. It's an amazing publication. How many blog posts do you see there, and how many podcasts do you see every week? One podcast versus so many blog posts, right?
Yeah.
Look at the competition. I think podcasts are very few compared to blog posts, and that's sort of an interesting way because to me, my blogs have reached a mark of 1 million reads. And the podcast is at sort of 120,000. That's 1/10 less. But in terms of listening experiences, almost twice the time. So
Right.
people have listened to this podcast now for 5 years, and that's sort of really crazy, right?
That's a cool metric.
You get to connect with people in a long format. So people that
Yeah.
connect with the podcast really get a bigger depth of knowledge. I feel more. I guess it's just an alternate form, but I really enjoy it.
Yeah. So one of the things that came out of, I think I was speaking to Ken G, who I think might be doing your podcast as well at some point.
Thanks to you. Yes.
Oh well, yeah, happy to connect you guys. But so he's got this big YouTube channel. I think he's 50,000 plus subscribers type thing. So he's pretty big. And
Ken
one
is
of the things,
amazing.
yeah, no, he's great content. And one of the things that I thought was really cool that he brought up during our conversation was he said like, the big advantage to having a podcast, audio or video, is that when you then go to interview at a company, you can share some examples of your podcast and they've kind of like heard you talk before. So there's this feeling of intimacy, this feeling that you actually know the person on some level that transcends just the written word. And that kind of starts to bias things a little bit in your direction. It also shows that you're able to think on your feet and articulate thoughts. So anyway, was that something that like, had you been able to share, for example, the Chaitan Data Science show with, for example, H2O when you applied? Was that part of your application package?
Definitely. And so I'd already interviewed people from H2O on the blog series, so they already knew about me in some format, and they had I think right now they do as well, I hope. But I think at the company they've really enjoyed the series, so it was a factor for sure.
That's brilliant. Actually, I love especially that idea of like targeting people within the company to interview them, to get to know them. I mean, it's a great way to do it. And at the very least, even if it doesn't go anywhere, you'll learn an awful lot about what it's like to work at that company. Like, were you able to benefit from that? Like, did you learn any cultural kind of information or any technical information about the kind of work that they did at the company that maybe helped you downstream in interviews?
For sure. And even otherwise, how I look at interviews is these are, I, who wouldn't want to interview people that they really look up to? Who
Right.
wouldn't want to ask them so many questions? Now I have an excuse. Hey, I'm going to broadcast this to a few people, and they'll also
Yeah.
get to learn. And they say yes most of the times.
Yeah. It's amazing how open people are, right?
Definitely. And I had Sarah Hooker on the podcast. She said this really important thing, which was when you're just starting out, you wouldn't be able to estimate how many important people will open your email. And I completely agree with her. So
Yeah.
yes, in hindsight, I've been exposed to so many different cultures, region-wise speaking as well. I think it's an interesting topic that even when I'm able to meet someone from Canada or from Europe, I know how to talk to them. I understand their accent a little faster, which
Yeah.
is somewhat helpful. It helps you connect with them, I think, to a different level if you're able to talk in their references, and so as well for their company cultures.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think that those are all kind of really important aspects of this in terms of orienting yourself culturally. I think one of the cool things about what you've been up to too is you've been doing all this remote networking. So you've been essentially leveraging your podcast as maybe in the same way, and feel free to disagree or correct me on this, but in more or less the same way as a lot of people use meetups to sort of get some FaceTime with people to some degree when you can't be physically in the country because you're over in another time zone basically. Um, can you speak a little bit to maybe how that maps onto meetups, and then even what's happened as well in the time of COVID, because I think that will have affected things a bit potentially.
Sure. So disclaimer, I've never been to more than 10 meetups, I think, in-person meetups.
Mm-hmm.
So I really those are more awkward to me than online conversations. I find it more awkward to approach people on the in the real world than on the internet. In the internet, it's very easy to just drop a message on Slack or Zoom.
Right.
But I think, yeah, so for even for interviewing people, these are I try to reach out to people that I really look up to, and genuinely ask questions that I can't find answers to about them. So for example, someone like you would have done a lot of podcasts, so I wouldn't want to discuss the content that's already out there. What am I even
Right.
contributing there? That's how I would approach this. And yes, I get to meet many people as well.
And so, what are the hardest parts of And I do want to get to the COVID part of this too, because I think there's an interesting story there in terms of like you started off remote by default. And so like, did that help you? Do you find like your networking ability, I mean, has it improved? Has it basically been unchanged by the COVID situation?
I would say unchanged. So I've committed to releasing 2 episodes every week for no reason. I'm a madman. I just want to pursue this for 1 year and then write madman on my resume. That's my goal with it. Uh, but I try to estimate when will I be able to get someone on the podcast. The
Mhm.
estimate time is now longer compared to earlier because I know that some people would be more busy at home, contrary to what people would believe. Apart from that, the process has been same for me. It's a little easier because I don't have to correct the other person's video, but now everyone has a good enough setup. I don't need to help them set it up. Otherwise, it's unchanged. It's still the same thing. I'm still asking stupid questions to really smart people all the time.
I think actually that's such an underrated aspect of the whole podcast situation is like, I think a lot of people don't feel tooled to ask good questions. And I honestly think ignorance is one of the best positions to come at this from. And not that you are actually, I mean, you're unusually knowledgeable, but like if you don't know, if you're not a like cutting edge deep learning expert, um, you're in a better position to understand a certain kind of audience. Like it's no good if two super high level deep learning experts are communicating on that level such that no one else other than the people who attended NIPS already or and Europe's already would be able to kind of take on board. Like you're actually performing a bigger service, arguably, if you approach it from a position of kind of humility and lack of knowledge even.
I don't think it's humility. It's just that I try to do my homework and I would
Yeah.
prepare the questions before reading the content about the person. So, for example, if I'm interviewing someone who's done a PhD, I would at least skim through their PhD, but I'd make sure that I'd have the questions ready before that so that I can ask the right questions that I don't know the answers to before reading that, or prepare a theme before knowing what they're exactly doing. So I have some context that I can bring up, but have questions that outsiders would be interested in.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. And that's a really good, a really good clarification. You definitely do want to prepare for the interview, but I guess it's like the kinds of, if you're not an expert already in that field, you're in a great position to do that homework and come up with those really kind of more compelling questions potentially.
I mean,
Um,
I'm not an expert by any sense, but it sort of gives me a way to hand wave my argument, hand
yeah.
wave my way into an argument if I have some context.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm more thinking for people who are using this as a way of networking and getting into the job search, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know, there's usually a fair bit of imposter syndrome that goes into it. And I think it's usually you're going to do better than you think, at least in terms of just diving in. And like you said, people are more responsive than you might expect. Interviews will tend to go better than you might expect, as long as you do your homework, which I totally agree. Um, on that note, what would you say the like hardest parts of doing a podcast consistently are? Like if somebody's looking to get into it for this networking value, like what are some of the things that they might not expect necessarily would be blockers, and how do you overcome them?
Um, I really enjoy it. So I just look at it as different challenges that I need to figure my way around. But for me, it's almost disrespectful to the person that I've interviewed to request them, hey, is it okay if I release this in a few weeks? I have a long queue now. What I tend to do is I record 15 to 20 interviews in 1 month. That gives me a runway of 3 months. I have 2 months free to learn other stuff. Right now, I'm learning different things in data science, EDA, etc., etc. So for those 2 months I study, then the cycle repeats again. So just to me, that scheduling part is sort of a challenge. Apart from that, I really enjoy it. I just, people have been very kind to me. They always, almost always say yes to my request. They get on the podcast. And a second challenge I would say would be coming up with interesting questions, because people that I interview, they've given a lot of interviews already, most of
Yeah.
them. So to me, I also need to come up with questions that they'd find interesting, because that's where I think people really enjoy a conversation, not that if they keep giving the same answers over and over again. So just trying to
Yeah.
find those gaps.
Right. And including like impressing them to the point where they're willing to make an internal referral at the company. Like it really does require that kind of forethought, that sort of insight. That's really interesting. So apart from podcasting, because you've been involved in a lot of different networking strategies, developing them, what are some of your recommendations in terms of helping people network remotely?
One thing I really think I really don't understand why people do is they look at prerequisites of everything. I've never looked at job prerequisites, never looked at book prerequisites, never looked at prerequisites of anything. When I started machine learning, the general consensus at my university was this is something that only masters and PhD students do. I was like, sure, let me try it then. I'll have lesser competition because there lesser number of people in there.
Right.
So just show up at any meetup that you even remotely find interesting. Now it's just Zoom calls. Just show up there. Even if you don't know anything about the topic, I would join meetups that are in their fifth run. So 4 meetups have already happened. I have zero context, but I would just jump on the call, see what I can learn, ask respectfully and sincerely, hey, I'm new. This is what I'm interested in. Ask a few questions, and I think that's also an interesting way to learn and even meet people.
Interesting. Would you say you're an introvert, by the way?
I would say yes.
Okay, so how do you, because I know I'm an introvert, a ton of data scientists and machine learning engineers, people who live in that world of sort of, highly technical work, um, often are introverts. It's not to say that they all are, but how have you overcome that? I mean, introversion manifests in different ways, but like, do you have techniques that you've used to just get you over that hump of saying, okay, I'm just going to reach out to this person. I'm just going to do this thing that feels really uncomfortable?
Me as an introvert, and I think most introverts really enjoy planning a lot because for no
Yeah.
reason, I think there's no reason to that. So I would have a concrete plan of things I would want to do. Even with the podcast, just having ideas noted down, that makes it easier rather than keeping the conversation flowing nicely. It doesn't come naturally to me, I think. So just having those as a backup now, I don't really need it sometimes, but that's sort of helpful. Even when I go to meetups, just doing my homework, having a few things ready that I want to ask, I want to learn. That's helpful to me.
Interesting. And do you find it draining? Like because you have that introversion, do you find yourself sort of do you find it difficult to get motivated to show up to a meetup or to record a podcast?
I don't think so. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy learning. That's my understanding of it. But by default, left in a room, I would sit in a quiet corner. So I am
Right.
sort of that. I, in the podcast format, that's interesting because I know I'm going to talk to the person, I'm going to
Yeah.
interview them, so I'm more prepared, and I go in with that mindset.
Okay, so that actually, I guess, that aligns well with what you were talking about earlier in terms of preferring to do one-on-one podcast style conversations rather than going to a meetup. I guess for that reason, right? In a meetup, you're more kind of having to struggle with that initial introduction.
Yeah, I find it awkward to walk up to people, introduce myself, and talk about different things because it is sort of awkward. You're trying to break the ice. In podcasting, it's easier because I know plenty about the person when I'm going to interview them, so
Yeah.
that's easier. One another thing that I find helpful for meeting people at meetups is if you want to meet people, host a talk or just host a meetup. People
Right.
will be forced to talk to you. I do that a lot. Makes my life easier, and it's also people really enjoy or really respect the fact that if you start a session and if you're worried that no one would join, just join a group, drop a message, hey, I want to learn this, would anyone like to join me?
Yeah.
I can guarantee you more you'll have an audience of more than what you'd expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I really like this because I think there's a lot to this idea of tailoring your networking strategy to your personality. I think most people tend to look at this as something that, I should send LinkedIn messages, I should attend meetups, I should do a podcast or whatever. But really, depending on the way you respond to social interaction, like a meetup, yes, these are things that I just dread. They're just not my space either, partly because of that introversion thing. Whereas, yeah, a podcast does feel more intimate. It can feel awkward sending that original reach out message, but that's where your competitive advantage is probably going to lie because you're going to be able to connect with somebody a little bit more deeply. It's going to be perhaps a more meaningful interaction in that sense. For extroverts, maybe a meetup makes sense. Maybe that's the sort of thing where your comparative advantage lies in your ability to show up in person and really kind
Yeah,
of engage people.
And on that topic, I think we've talked about this earlier, offline, online as well. In the startup world, we say 80% is good enough. And I
Yeah.
think that that's one thing I've learned a lot, which is I don't need to know X much to be able to interview someone who's doing a PhD. If I do my homework to an enough extent, that's good enough. If I prepare, sometimes I'd prepare for 1 week, 10 days even, just reading up, doing my homework. That's good enough. I don't need to cover every single thing out there.
Yeah, actually, and so I love that point. I think there's a sense in which, again, for introverts, I'm speaking to people like us here mostly,
Yeah.
but there's something magical about the process of setting up a podcast where you're able to separate the key steps of the engagement that otherwise you'd be procrastinating on forever. So you can tell yourself, for example, okay, by Friday, I will have messaged like X many people on Twitter or by email.
Yeah.
And then like once you've messaged them, right, you're committed. So now you're going to do your homework and get ready for that episode.
Yeah.
So it has a way of bringing the long-term aspirational you in touch with the short-term like limbic reward you who just doesn't want to get out of bed and do anything. As long as you take
Absolutely.
those simple actions that commit you, yeah, to like downstream consequences, then you're in the game.
Absolutely. And I think what's been helpful to me, pretty much anyone in STEM is sort of a perfectionist. They'd like to really work on things, especially if you're on the internet. The Twitter machine learning community really shows nice projects. But instead, what was helpful to me, even with blogging, I had committed to one blog a week schedule, which was
Yeah.
pretty crazy to me. Now seems less crazy because now I've committed to 2 episodes every week. So I need
Yeah.
to make that happen. And it's not a mad rush. I need to also ensure that these are up to a standard. Not trying
Mhm.
to act too smart or talk too wise, but I try to keep them up to a standard. The audio and video quality are different aspects, but even the questions up to a standard. So now I need to make sure that that happens in the schedule. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have never even published anything at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. The 80-20 rule is so important and it holds back so much, like letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. You're never going to release those podcasts. You're never going to get the opportunity to talk to more people if that's what you do. I guess that applies to just sort of at a data science level as well. There are variants on this, but when you build a project, for example, it's very easy to say, oh, well, I need to do this extra piece of work. I need to like I don't know, I need to make my front end prettier. I need to use a different kind of like more efficient query here or whatever. But at a certain point, like you just have to launch. You just have to put the project out there or the podcast out there. Do you have any advice for people who might be struggling with that moment of saying like, how do I hit that big button? How do I post it to the internet?
Um, there's always an hesitance to that. I feel even still. So I don't mind looking like an idiot on my podcast because I know I'm the biggest idiot on my podcast that shows up in every single episode. That sort of
I
makes
think
me
you're
reluctant.
leaving out the episodes that I've been on, but yeah.
Um, I won't argue on that because you will keep disagreeing. I'll keep disagreeing. Um, but yeah, so committing to it and usually trying to get some honest feedback is helpful. There'll always be people that really enjoy whatever you're doing. Some people will be critical. Some will pass on negative comments no matter what. So and this is another interesting topic which I've become interested in, because whenever you've committed yourself to during the initial period, whatever you put out won't matter as much, or it won't be as great just because you're learning.
Mhm.
And to
Mhm.
me, let me just put it keep it to myself because I don't want to offend anyone. To me, it's also important that I don't spam anyone or I don't create something that I think is really important and it's just something that I've learned in the last week, last month. So figure out what you want to do, figure out where you are, and don't to me that's just my advice to myself, don't take too much pride in what I've put together. If it's something that I've just learned last month, that's all I know about it. I probably know less than 1%. So
Yeah.
don't expect it to be something greater than that.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think there's a sense in which when you start to collaborate with people, especially in industry, when you start to work with machine learning engineers, even like machine learning researchers, you start to realize just how many open questions people have day to day, and how loose people are with saying like, yeah, you know what, like I'm not sure I know how the atom optimizer works. Like, or I'm not sure I know, like, how does OOB error work again? Like these kinds of things where you tend to think that companies expect perfection because the job interview it kind of seems like school in a way. It fools you into thinking that you're supposed to put your correct answer in this perfect little box.
Yeah,
And if you don't put the answer there, you're wrong and you're not going to get the job or whatever. But in reality, it's this much more fluid, dynamic, and collaborative process. And I don't know, does that come across during interviews as well? Like that sort of openness that you get from revealing to yourself your own shortcomings and ignorance. Like, does that translate into the job interview?
absolutely. One thing I really respected or really enjoyed while joining H2O, and I'm not sure if every job contract has this, but this was my first full-time role. At the bottom of the contract that I signed, there was a note which is, we hope you find this and to be an interesting challenge, something along these lines. I don't remember the exact words. An interesting challenge, and you get to learn a lot. To me, I at college anticipated that I would learn everything right now and then join a job. I was
Right.
so wrong. You get to the actual learning starts when you join a role, and that's true too. I think even interviews on the podcast or job interviews, you get to learn a lot and optimize in different ways. I feel like at least that's been my experience.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect of it too, because we do tend to freeze up more when we start thinking of the job interview as an adversarial process. When we start to think of like the interviewer as like this teacher who's checking your homework, and then like you better have done it, and if you haven't, then you're in trouble. Like that takes away to some degree your ability to have that fluid, productive conversation that is what every interview feels like ideally. I mean, I know when we've hired at Sharpest Minds, like we've been most impressed when we have a candidate who comes in and says like, yeah, I don't know what I'd do in this situation. What would you do in this situation? And then all of a
Mm.
sudden you're having this dialogue and you're like, oh, I'm starting to get a feel for how it would be like to work with this person. Um,
In job interviews or even otherwise, one thing that I found people really enjoy is if you don't know something and if you look it up. So let's say in coding rounds, you sharing your screen and you end up googling a term, looking up a term, and then implementing on spot. That's some
right,
people would take as in memory it as a very negative point, and some engineers really respected that. Hey, this person was able to look this up, implement it then and there, and make it work. And that's how I think a lot of things happen in industry. You're given a deadline, you need to pull it together and push to production.
yeah, there's so many things like that, right? Where the more comfortable you can get in your own skin, the more you can accept your own level of ignorance or your own level of just basic curiosity. I think it ends up looking something like humility, but I think you're right. It's not quite humility. It's not quite the same thing. It's
Yeah,
comfort, right? I mean,
you sort of get a framework of how to navigate things. I think that would be one okay way to put it, I guess.
yeah, yeah. But whatever it is, it's a critical ingredient of not just collaboration, but also doing those interviews, I think. And anyway, it's something that the most outstanding candidates I've ever seen, they always embody that characteristic. You have what feels like a dialogue because they're admitting ignorance, but then they ask questions that kind of like, as the interviewer, you kind of go, oh man, I'm not sure what our numbers are for that. Like,
Yeah,
and then maybe you're looking stuff up and they're looking stuff up. That's an amazing interview when you hit
definitely.
that point. Yeah. And you're polishing those skills for your podcast too, right? I mean, that's part of the advantage.
Yes. Podcast I think is more soft skills, but also some
Mhm.
knowledge because I get to get some insights. Another thing that I want to mention is when at least on the internet you read different things, it's sort of a requirement for the best, the ideal, the data scientist that the world would want. In
Right.
reality, when you're seeking a job, you'd want to figure out how to make money using the skills that you have, which is not to disrespect the profession, but you need to get into an industry and then figure out how can you learn there, how can you grow there. That's
Right.
that's one thing I was very wrong about. That I need to absolutely know XYZ to be able to contribute to something. Otherwise, I am of no use.
So what are the kinds of things that mentality caused you to overemphasize when you were in the job search? What sorts of things did you spend time on that now in retrospect you might not spend as much time on?
Um, so To me, I don't think there were any, to be completely honest, there weren't any frameworks around it. It was just driven by my curiosity pretty much. So they,
Oh, but I guess, sorry, I guess I mean like when you're thinking, when you approach a data science job and you tell yourself, well, there's this ideal of the, full stack data scientist
hmm,
who can do clustering, who can do classification, they can do deep learning, they can do time series, they do everything.
gotcha.
And yeah, so like how do you, what are some of the, what would you have done? Um, or how would you have interpreted blog posts that say like, oh yeah, like here's the full stack data scientist, you need to know all these things. Like, how would your attitude have changed knowing then what you know now?
Gotcha. So, sorry for misinterpreting that.
No, no.
Um, I think look at a job role and see, or how I would approach it is just talk to the person and see if I'd find that problem interesting enough to solve. And people really look at, I would look at different things and think if I be able to solve it. Once you get into a software role or anything in STEM, you'd get bored very fast if you're repeating the same stuff. So you'd want to find challenging problems that A can be solved, B can be solved by you. So that
Mm-hmm.
would be my advice to me, which is to look for things that I'd be interested in solving and be able to solve myself.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's like, you said earlier, you need to find a way to make money with your skills. And I actually agree. I think it's easy to lose sight of like what the function of money is in the economy in the ideal sense. So money, one of its properties is that it conveys information, right? So like if a problem is more valuable to solve, in general, it will tend to be associated with some financial compensation. And so when you look up companies and you look up job descriptions and ask yourself like, okay, people are paying good amounts of money to get people to solve these kinds of problems. One of the things I think you'll start to notice is that often those job descriptions have clusters, and
Hmm.
those clusters don't involve knowing everything.
Yeah.
One cluster might be focused on like, you need to get really good at doing sentiment analysis on customer review data. And if you get really good at that skill set, that does not involve doing time series analysis. It generally doesn't involve doing reinforcement learning. It won't, there are a whole bunch of things that it immediately excludes completely. And then you're able to just spend all your time on this core skill set that is packaged in such a way as to fit into this like little market niche that's associated with well-defined jobs. Is that something that you've observed as well? Is that a technique that you've sort of been leveraging?
I completely agree with that. I couldn't have put it more nicely. To me, and we talked about this, but to me, I started with freelancing. So I
Mm-hmm.
would really value my hour based on what I was billed. And that sort of put me in the perspective of really respecting my own time as a student, which to me was very counterintuitive because pretty much I'd just be otherwise wasting my time all day. So that's how I would look at how can I maximize what I give some person whom I'm working with in a few hours, so, to an extent that they get more value out of it. And that's true to any company as well, right? In data science, you get somewhat higher salaries. That's the norm.
Mm-hmm.
That's because they get more value out of that role, and you need to figure out how can you contribute to that role. That's my reflection on it in hindsight, I guess.
And in terms of freelancing, like, so I've never freelanced online, but so what websites did you use and how did you get your first freelancing gigs back in the day?
Through meeting people in communities. So that's why I
Oh,
really love it. And I have a title that I've given myself, which is community taught ML engineer. Even though I
yeah.
had a CS degree, I don't think that helped me make a bit me become a better coder at all, or any of the sentiments that prevail in the community. So I would just reach out to people in different Slack communities. And this was interesting because I wasn't bounded by my university. So I wasn't talking to my peers who had some perspective. Hey, I know this person, he did XYZ, and we all
Yeah.
should do this. I know this person who did a master's, they got a job in Canada or in the US. I'm going to do that. And now
Yeah.
everyone is sort of trying to do that. Instead, I would just take any or all online courses, sort of brute force my way around it, and that wasn't as helpful as the Slack communities around it where I would just talk to people. Hey, I found this interesting. I don't know if you worked on it, because people of all different backgrounds would be there. And I just connected with someone who was at the time looking for some project that I was sort of just playing around. That's how the connect happened. And that was very easy to me compared to what people would perceive how hard freelancing is.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And a higher quality connection too. Yeah, it just really consistently seems like no matter how often I find myself recommending this sort of thing, it seems like people still undervalue these sorts of approaches. There's such a pull towards doing the generic thing and like going for the job board, going for LinkedIn or whatever. And really this community building, it's part of building your brand too, right? I mean, it's part of building equity in a community.
I've been able to convince my roommate from college to go to Canada, join a university with minimum requirements, join Sharpest Minds, and show up at every meetup. So I've been able to sell him to this approach, and he's really a fan of this approach as well.
Amazing. Well, we'll look forward to having him. Yeah, I think that's actually that's one thing. Obviously, like Sharpest Minds is one way to do mentorship, and like we do income share based mentorships and all that. But I do think there's also like there's a potential to get a certain amount, at least, of free mentorship in the community, and just like reaching out to people. Do you have any tips about that? Like, I guess just to preface, one thing I've seen people and people have reached out to me on LinkedIn this way. They'll be like, hey, like, can you mentor me? Can you be my mentor? In their initial message. And that doesn't tend to work super well with most people. So then that leads to the question, yeah, like how should people approach this? If you do want that mentorship, how should you go about exploring that possibility?
I guess people don't realize, since it's very easy now to contact different people, you'd want to stand out, which is obvious to any
Right.
single thing. Whatever is common doesn't stand out. So when you're reaching out to someone who you're looking to get mentored from, if you just leave a hi, how are you, and expect a reply, you wouldn't get it. Uh,
Yeah.
that's counterintuitive, but you're also sort of trying to be polite. So ask a directed question. That's one thing I've learned. People love sharing their knowledge. At least someone who has a good amount of knowledge would love to answer your question, especially if it's related to their interests. So for example, if I was to reach out to you, I would ask, hey Jeremy, I know you're involved in the Canada hiring scene. I was looking to join a role in machine learning. Do you know where should I apply, or which community should I reach out to?
Mm-hmm.
That would be my message.
Yeah. And actually, one thing too on that note is at least what I found successful when we've been A/B testing different things at Sharpest Minds is if you can find a piece of content that the person you're reaching out to has written, a
Yeah.
blog post, a podcast, a project on GitHub, like flag it in there. Hey, I saw this work that you did. I thought it was really interesting. Would love to talk about it. People love to talk about themselves, and if you can kind of prompt that sort of thinking, then it's a good way
Absolutely.
to get somebody's attention. Yeah.
But make sure you read it, because the other person will know
Yes.
really fast.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very good point. Yeah, do your homework seems to be one of the big themes of today's conversation. Great. So, is there anything else you want to toss out there, Sanyam? Any final thoughts about networking or community building?
Um, I think now is a good time, if you have a good enough internet to enjoy this podcast. Hopefully, you didn't make it through the entire conversation because I would have bored you. But if you did, join any online community if you have the time. At H2O.ai, we're running a course where even a few Kaggler grandmasters, the top 10 in the world, actually the former one just taught a lecture, former number one on competitions, just
Oh,
taught a
nice.
lecture. You could you can find all of this knowledge freely everywhere. Everyone is doing online meetups. Just show up at one. If you're new to machine learning, show up at any meetup. Most of
Mm-hmm.
us have a good amount of idea about what we're talking about, but not an idea about the field. Ask as many questions. Use a pseudonym on the internet if you're too shy
Right.
about your reputation, and just use this opportunity. I would say just join communities, listen to podcasts. Now would be a good time. You can also watch them. Join any lecture groups. I think now is a great time, because college is more of a streaming service at this time.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. The human element is like the biggest differentiator at this point. So that's great. All right, really appreciate it. Sanyam, can you share your Twitter handle? I know you're active on Twitter, so.
Sure, it's Bhutani Sanyam 1, my second name followed by my first name. Or you could check out the podcast if the audience is curious. I release 2 episodes every week. It's just ctds.show.
Perfect. All right, we'll link to all that too. We have a blog post that'll accompany the podcast. If you're watching or listening, you can go check that out too on Towards Data Science. I was going to say toursdatascience.com, but I'm sure it's there. I think you can also get it though through Medium. So thanks so much, Sanyam. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks for stopping by.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's always really great to talk to you. Thank you so much.